Picture this. You are holding a receipt in your hand. Like right there on the paper, in bold, undeniable ink, it says that a massive, life-ruining debt has been paid in full.
Yeah, completely zeroed out.
Exactly. The transaction is complete, the account is settled, so why are you still sitting in the dark, jumping at every single shadow, absolutely terrified that the debt collectors are about to, kick down your door?
It makes no sense, right? But that's exactly the reality for so many people.
It really is. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are pulling from a very specific stack of source material. A preface and a detailed Q&A to a text titled Already Completed Salvation-Romans-Roman numeral 1.
Right.
And our mission today is to look through this highly unique lens the author uses to decode the book of Romans. We are specifically trying to figure out why a religion that's fundamentally designed to, liberate people so often leaves them feeling just utterly crushed by guilt.
Yeah, that disconnect between the promise of a sacred text and the lived reality of its readers is, it's a profound paradox.
Oh, absolutely.
You have millions of people interacting with a framework that explicitly claims to offer freedom, right? Yet they find themselves caught in this psychological loop of anxiety. They're forever feeling like they are operating at a deficit.
Okay, let's unpack this because we are talking about an audience that already knows the book of Romans is basically the heavyweight champion of theological texts.
Oh, sure.
We really don't need to rehash how it shaped historical Christian thought. We know it triggered Augustine's conversion, it led Luther's Reformation, made Wesley's heart strangely warm, all that.
Right, the historical pedigree is already established.
Yeah, so the author actually skips past those basic historical accolades to point out a glaring, really uncomfortable contradiction. If this text is the ultimate roadmap to a clean slate, why do so many sincere believers sit in pews week after week reading these exact chapters and still lack the basic assurance that their slate is actually wiped clean?
They're still operating as if that massive debt is hanging right over their heads.
Exactly. They have the receipt, but they're still terrified of the debt collector.
This raises an important question, and it's really the central mystery that the author sets out to solve here.
Yeah.
The premise is that these readers aren't lacking sincerity. They aren't lacking dedication. What they are missing is a structural key.
A structural key, okay.
Yeah, according to the author's analysis, the prevailing way people read this text ignores a crucial unifying thread, like the very thing that makes the entire mechanism of salvation function.
And the text refers to this missing element as the gospel of the water and the Spirit.
Yes, exactly. The gospel of the water and the Spirit.
Which, that sounds incredibly poetic. But the author is actually using it to describe a very rigid, almost mechanical recentering of how Jesus' ministry was structured.
It is. It's a fundamental shift in the actual physics of how this theology operates.
Physics is a good word for it.
Yeah, because the author argues that humanity's core problem, this inescapable deficit of sin, it wasn't solved by a single isolated event. Instead, the solution relies on a highly specific, inseparable, twofold structural ministry. It's like a locked two-part equation.
And if you ignore one half of that equation,
the mathematical proof of the whole system just collapses, which is exactly why the author believes so many readers are trapped in guilt. They are trying to solve an equation with half the variables missing.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because if you look at the cultural footprint of Christianity, regardless of your personal background, the focus is almost entirely on the cross.
Oh, yeah, 100%.
Right. The art, the architecture, mainstream theology, it all points to that singular moment.
Right.
But this author steps in and says that the cross, while essential, is only step 2.
Yes.
There's an equally critical, structurally mandatory first step that is almost entirely overlooked, which is the water.
The water. And in this specific framework, the water refers directly to Jesus receiving baptism from John the Baptist.
Right, in the Jordan River.
Exactly. And the text insists this was not merely like some symbolic ritual or a public declaration of his ministry.
It wasn't just a photo op.
No, not at all. The author frames the baptism as a definitive legal transaction. This was a precise historical moment when Jesus took all the sins of the world onto his own body. It was the literal transfer of the cosmic debt.
Okay, I buy the logic of needing a mechanism for a transaction, but isn't that a massive conceptual leap?
How so?
Well, to say that a washing ritual in a river is the literal mechanism for assuming global debt, it flips the traditional narrative completely on its head. The cultural assumption is that the cross handled both the assumption of the debt and the payment, like simultaneously.
Right, simultaneously. But what's fascinating here is the underlying legal logic the author uses to separate those two actions.
Okay, break that down.
Think back to the banking analogy you used earlier. You cannot logically or even legally pay the penalty for a debt that you have not yet assumed.
Oh, right.
The author's framework dictates that the penalty of sin could not be borne on the cross unless the sin itself had already been legally transferred to Jesus.
Yeah, if I walk into a bank and try to hand them $1 million to pay off a mortgage that isn't in my name, the bank system physically cannot process the transaction.
Exactly. It would reject it.
The debt has to be legally transferred to my account first before I can pay it.
And the author applies that exact standard of jurisprudence to the theology here. Within this twofold structure, the baptism, the water, is the legal assumption of the debt.
Okay.
And the cross, the blood, is the payment of that debt. They are completely inseparable.
You can't have one without the other.
Right. You cannot have the payment without the prior transfer, and the transfer inherently demands the payment. These two ministries form one single unified structure of salvation.
Which totally explains the lingering guilt we talked about at the very beginning.
Yep.
If a believer's entire theological framework only includes the cross, they are essentially staring at a payment receipt for an account they don't actually believe was ever transferred.
Wow. Yeah, exactly.
They're missing the moment the debt was actually taken off their shoulders, so they assume they are still personally liable.
They are trapped trying to pay a debt that, according to the author's reading of the text, was legally removed from their ledger at the baptism.
Man, that's heavy.
It is. Without understanding the water, the blood loses its structural foundation. And this is why the author believes believers continue to suffer. They are trying to access the relief of step 2 without acknowledging the mechanics of step 1.
So with this twofold lens established, the author promises to decode the first 9 chapters of Romans.
Right.
And the text makes a real point to avoid just walking through the chapters like some dry table of contents. It actually frames the progression of these chapters as a profound psychological map.
It really becomes a diagnostic tool for human behavior. When the author applies the lens of the water and the spirit to the early chapters of Romans, like chapters 1 and 3 revealing the true righteousness of God, the text transforms. It goes from a disjointed set of ancient rules into a highly logical critique of how humans attempt to manage their own guilt.
Like in chapter 2, the author zeroes in on Paul's critique of Jewish religious formalism.
Right, formalism.
And through our new lens, formalism isn't just an ancient historical issue. It is the universal human default.
Oh, absolutely.
When we don't understand that the debt was permanently transferred, our instinct is to try to pay it off ourselves through just relentless, obsessive rule following.
Because formalism is, at its core, the ultimate manifestation of anxiety.
Yeah.
It is the belief that if you just check enough boxes, perform the right rituals, or, maintain a flawless outward appearance, you can somehow balance the cosmic scales.
Which is impossible.
Exactly. The author highlights that Paul was actively attacking this mindset, pointing out that human effort cannot settle an account of this magnitude.
It is exactly like trying to pay off that multi-million-dollar mortgage using Monopoly money.
That's a great way to put it.
You can stack up as many colorful paper bills as you want. You can present them to the bank teller with absolute sincerity, but the currency is completely useless for the reality of the debt.
Completely useless.
And we see this exact same formalism in secular life all the time, don't we?
Oh, everywhere.
People obsess over productivity metrics or social status or perfectionism. They're constantly checking boxes to prove their intrinsic worth, terrified that if they slip up, their deficit will be exposed.
And the psychological burden of that constant performance is just unsustainable.
Yeah, you burn out.
Which is exactly where the author's decoding of the text takes a brilliant, albeit kind of challenging, turn.
Okay.
When human formalism inevitably fails, like when you realize the monopoly money isn't working, the text pushes the reader into the territory of chapter 7.
Right, chapter 7.
And this is where the author introduces the concept of the absolute necessity of despair.
Okay, I have to push back on that word necessity.
Why is that?
Well, why in the world would despair be a mandatory prerequisite for a message that is ultimately supposed to be about liberation and peace?
I see what you mean.
Culturally, we treat despair as a failure of faith, right? Something to be avoided at all costs. To frame it as a necessary stepping stone just sounds incredibly bleak.
It does sound bleak at first glance, But if we connect this to the bigger picture of the author's psychological map, despair isn't a failure. It is the breaking of an
The
illusion.
breaking of an illusion.
Yeah. As long as a person believes their formalism is working, as long as they think they can manage the debt on their own, they remain completely closed off to the external solution of the twofold ministry.
Oh, wow. That makes me think of a survival situation.
Wow, so.
Imagine you are wandering in a dense forest. As long as you maintain the illusion that you are just, a little turned around, you will keep walking. You'll keep relying on your own broken internal compass, and you will absolutely refuse to shoot off a flare or look at a map.
Right, you think you've got it handled.
Exactly. You will actually fight anyone who tries to rescue you because you haven't admitted you need rescuing.
Yeah.
It is only when you finally sit down on a log, look around at the fading light and think, I am completely hopelessly lost, that you become receptive to outside help.
That realization, that total collapse of self-reliance, that is the despair the author finds in Chapter 7.
Okay, I see it now.
It is the psychological catalyst required to shatter the trap of formalism. You have to mourn the death of your own ability to save yourself before you can accept a salvation that was accomplished entirely outside of your efforts.
So you have to fully experience the crushing weight of the impossible debt before you can feel the euphoria of the receipt that says paid in full.
Exactly.
The despair is just the exhaustion of trying to pay with monopoly money.
Yes.
And that exhaustion is what finally allows the reader to cross the threshold into Chapter 8.
And Chapter 8 is the resolution of all that psychological tension. It contains the famous declaration that there is no condemnation. But the author's critical point here is that this no condemnation is not some arbitrary blanket statement of divine amnesia.
God didn't just forget the debt.
No, it is the direct logical result of the legal transaction we discussed earlier. The sins transferred at the baptism and the judgment borne on the cross.
So the lack of condemnation isn't God just deciding to ignore the rules. It's the fact that the rules were fully satisfied by the twofold structure.
Exactly. The author's decoding reveals a beautifully unified progression. You start by recognizing the futility of formalism, you pass through the necessary despair of your own inadequacy, and you arrive at the unshakable assurance that the entire process was already handled for you.
So what does this all mean, like on a practical level? The author makes a very pointed statement in the preface about the intended audience for this breakdown.
Yeah, the target demographic.
This sermon booklet is explicitly not an academic commentary. It is not designed for high-tower theological wrangling or debate.
No, the text is formatted as a practical Q&A, specifically engineered for people who are suffering.
Real people.
Real people. It targets individuals who have been in the faith for a long time, but are just exhausted from the endless cycle of striving and failing. The goal is to move them from theoretical knowledge to applied reality.
And the overarching theme that binds this entire source together is the concept of already completed salvation.
Yes, already completed.
The author's earnest prayer is that readers will stop trying to add their own monopoly money to the equation and instead accept this fulfilled structural reality is what they call living faith.
It completely shifts the psychological burden off of the individual.
Yeah, it demands a paradigm shift from active striving to passive acceptance.
Which, ironically, is profoundly difficult for human beings to execute.
Oh, it's the hardest thing in the world.
We are wired to want to contribute to our own rescue. Relinquishing control and admitting that we bring absolutely nothing of value to the transaction, that attacks our ego.
We desperately want to pull out our wallets and say, hey, let me at least pitch in a few bucks for the cosmic debt,
Right, let me do my part.
But the author is saying the transaction is closed. The vault is locked. By fully embracing the logic of the water and the blood, it transforms the entire religious experience from a never-ending, exhausting checklist of what you must do into a peaceful, grounded acceptance of what is already done.
That transition from do to done is the cure for the paradox we started with.
Yeah.
If you are stuck in the do phase, anxiety is inevitable. You will constantly question if your sincerity was enough, if your repentance was deep enough, if your formalism met the standard.
Daily questioning.
But if you move to the done phase, the anxiety evaporates because the outcome no longer relies on your performance.
It relies entirely on the historical reality of the baptism and the cross.
Exactly.
The author isn't trying to win an abstract debate about ancient history here. The goal is to fundamentally alter the reader's current daily psychological state.
It is treating the root cause of the guilt, right? That belief that you are still liable for the debt rather than just putting a Band-Aid on the symptoms.
Because knowledge is only valuable when it is understood and applied.
Right. The author's intent is to take this robust theological framework and use it to cure the very modern anxiety of never feeling like you are enough.
As we bring this deep dive to a close, let's look back at the journey the author took us on.
Yeah.
We started with the heavy paradox of believers feeling crushed by the very text meant to free them.
Yeah.
And the author of Already Completed Salvation-Romans-Roman numeral 1 argues this is caused by a structural misunderstanding of the mechanics of salvation.
Right, and the solution provided by the text is the unified twofold ministry of Jesus. First, the water, the baptism by John, which serves as the legal transfer and assumption of humanity's sin.
Step 1.
Step 1. And second, the blood, the cross, which serves as the legal payment for that specific transferred debt. Step 2.
Beautiful.
By applying the gospel of the water and the Spirit to Romans, the text is decoded not as a list of impossible demands, but as an announcement of an already completed reality.
It is the difference between holding a map that shows you how you might eventually climb out of a pit and holding a certified document that proves you were already airlifted out before you even realized you were trapped.
That's a great way to summarize it.
And that leaves us with a really fascinating concept to chew on as we wrap up.
Yeah, because the psychological progression we discussed, moving from the exhaustion of formalism through the necessary breaking point of despair, and finally into total relief, it has implications far beyond just theology.
So here's a final thought for you to mull over as you go about your day. We've been discussing this theology of an already completed baseline, where the biggest, most existential deaths are permanently handled, and moments of utter despair are actually just catalysts for realizing you don't have to fix everything yourself.
Right.
How might adopting that exact same mindset change your secular life?
Oh, that's interesting.
If you truly accepted an already completed baseline of your own intrinsic worth, a worth that requires no monopoly money to maintain, how differently would you handle your everyday failures at work? How would it change your anxieties about the future? Or the heavy burden of imposter syndrome? If the ultimate ledger is already balanced, maybe we don't have to be so terrified of the daily math.
It is a profound challenge to stop striving for a baseline of worth we already possess and to let the reality of what is already completed dictate how we live today.
Something to think about the next time you feel that familiar heavy weight settling on your shoulders. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning those old assumptions, keep looking for new lenses, and we will catch you next time.